This is Relationscapes, the podcast where we map the geography of human connection. I'm journalist Blair Hodges, and our guide in this episode is author Eliza Hull.
I'm still the parent. I'm still capable. I do everything for my children, just like any non-disabled parent would. But there is something really beautiful as I'm crossing the road and my daughter is holding my hand and telling me, to watch out for the step ahead. That to me is building a very compassionate, kind human being.
Eliza Hull loves being a parent, and becoming one meant overcoming a lot of stigma because Eliza is disabled. And it's not uncommon for friends, strangers, and even some doctors to tell people with disabilities they just aren't fit for the job. But the reality is there are millions of disabled parents in the United States and in countries like Australia, where Eliza is from, deaf or blind parents, parents who use wheelchairs or other assistive devices, parents with intellectual disabilities or autoimmune conditions, and more. We meet some of these parents in Eliza's book, We've Got This, Stories by Disabled Parents. What these stories reveal isn't parental weakness, it's systemic prejudice, which Eliza and other disabled parents are fighting to overcome with persistence and creativity. Eliza joins us to talk about it right now. Eliza Hull, welcome to Relationscapes. We're talking about your book, We've Got This, Stories by Disabled Parents, and it's great to be with you.
No, thank you very much for having me.
So your book exists in part because when you were preparing to become a parent yourself, you spent hours and hours searching bookstores for something that could answer some questions that you had about parenting. You're a disabled person, and you had questions about what the experience might be like to become a parent. And there are thousands of parenting books. There's just so many parenting books to choose from. Your problem wasn't trying to pick the right one. The problem you faced was you couldn't find one. Talk about that experience.
Yeah, that's right. So I have had my disability. I have a condition called Charcot-Marie tooth, and I've had that since I was 5 years old. And it affects the way that I walk. It also affects my hands. I fall over a lot. And throughout my life, I guess my parents, whilst they were, worried about my disability when it first appeared when I was 5 and tried to, fix it and through lots of surgery operations, there was, one positive in that they never thought that I couldn't be a parent and always assumed that if that's what I wanted, that was something that I could do. It wasn't until I went to my neurologist at the time that I'd been seeing for many years, and I just met my partner and really wanted to start a family, that I was met with medicalized stigma. And he said to me that he didn't think that I should be a parent. I think that came down to the genetic component of my disability, because I have a 50% chance of passing on my disability. But he also just thought that I couldn't manage. He was worried about me picking up my baby, holding my baby. And that really, set in a lot of vulnerability and shame and anxiety. And so at the time, I was really just seeking any kind of book that I could turn to, feel less alone in my decision to be a parent and to know ways to be adaptable, to know, little tips that other disabled parents had achieved, or just learning what it was going to be like. But when I looked, I just couldn't find a book like this. And as you said in the introduction, you just get given so many books. There are just stacks of ways to be a parent, and yet there wasn't any disabled representation. And I then turned to the trusted internet and was, met with stories that it was really framed in that kind of deficit model, that it would be a negative and a burden for a child to have a parent with a disability, and kind of that, poor children to have a disabled mother or a disabled father. And so that again just reinforced that idea that to be a disabled parent was something that was a problem, was problematic, and ought to not happen. And so that's why I really decided that it was time that we, set the record straight and show that disabled people do make really incredible parents.
Right. There was just no visibility in the bookstores, at least. And you point out, though, that in Australia, about 15% of households have at least one parent with a disability there. In the United States, it's about 4.8 million households that have a parent with some kind of disability. And yet no books, no discussion. And you might find some things online, but a lot of discouragement or a lot of stigma. And as you mentioned, that also happens in the medical community. You point out here that being a disabled parent is a rebellious act because of these forces that are pushing against you, the medical system, and then society's assumptions about how to be a proper parent or what a child needs in a parent. So let's talk about that first huge force that you've already brought up, the medical system. And this is a pretty private conversation that you share with us in the book with your neurologist. And they told you that this wasn't a good idea. When you were in that moment, first of all, were you alone? Were you by yourself, or was your partner with you? And how did you react to that feedback that you got?
Yeah, at the time I was alone, and I was really just going for a general. I see my neurologist a fair bit just to talk about things that are changing with my disability, because my disability continually changes. And I think the first thing that I felt, I guess, was shame, and just that I started to believe him. I started to think, he's right. And that's what I had been really shown throughout time, through the media and lack of representation, that, maybe I shouldn't be a parent. Maybe I can't do this. Maybe this is a really bad idea. And so I think, luckily, having a really supportive partner, when I went home and told him what I'd been told by my neurologist, luckily he turned that around and said, no, I just don't believe that. I think that we will make a great family. And now I have, 2 great children that have really turned my life upside down in all the best ways. Yeah, but imagine if I had have listened. Imagine if I had have not gone down that path and instead believed the medicalized stigma and ableism that continues to exist. I think that people are afraid and often turn to this kind of fear-based mentality of what a disabled people can and can't do. And often it's very much in that model of can't do and a model of deficit. And I think, especially when you look at, medicalized professionals are throughout their careers and study taught to fix problems, really, taught to change people, for what they see as the better. But actually life is made up of diverse people and made up of, in Australia, 20% of our population have a disability. And so instead of looking into that medicalized, let's fix it model, why can't we look into fixing the world and changing the world so that disabled people can exist and live fulfilling lives? I think that the greatest barriers are the attitudes that we face and the physical barriers that I face out in the world. It's not how my disability affects me in my home that is completely accessible, which I've made it, that way. It's when I actually go out in society and face multiple staircases and paths that I can't get around because, they're not made for disabled people in mind. So I think that, it's tricky to change that medicalized model for many medical professionals, but I'm starting to see a real shift, which is great.
You mentioned how your neurologist was thinking in terms of whether you would pass a condition on, right? And this is something that not every parent in the book of essays has to deal with. Some parents are paralyzed in an accident or have a condition that's not genetic that they won't pass on. But yours is one that had a 50-50 chance, and you had your first child. And then when you decided to have a second child, you faced even more opposition. You talk about a conversation with an OB and one with a sonographer who's doing the sonogram, and you got more negative
Yeah, I
feedback
think
at
that
that point. And
they,
you'd already had a
again,
child at
just
that point.
still didn't believe that I could be a parent. And they, for instance, one person said, well, you won't be doing this again, will you? They really didn't want me to go ahead with the pregnancy. And
Right.
I guess they were always seeking to make sure that my child was non-disabled and in their eyes perfect.
Yeah. It's like a weird attempt at preventative medicine or something, but which would prevent the existence of these kids.
And that's the other thing. It would prevent the existence of these kids. But also, how can we ever know what a child will or won't have or develop in their life or experience in their life? Yeah, I think it's that kind of model of trying to control, what happens. And I guess for me, it was the most vulnerable part of being a disabled parent, was passing on my disability. And I think in the end, I just had to keep going back to, do I want to be in the world? And I have had a really great life, and I am disabled, and I've been disabled all my life, since I was 5. So since I can really remember. And I've lived a really fulfilling life. In fact, I'd go as far as saying that to be a disabled person has made my life better. I am a singer, and I feel like it's given me just a broader sense of what the world is. It's given me, I guess, more, emotion, feeling. I feel things. I understand a different perspective. I love to advocate for others. I feel like it's enabled me to see how wonderful diversity makes this world. And for that, I'm thankful for having a disability. And as I said, the greatest obstacles that I and all the parents in this book face is generally out in society, is generally when we go to our medical appointments, when we go out in the community and we're ridiculed, stared at, laughed at, or when we face physical barriers or a world that's not built for us. And so I guess that's why it was hard to make the decision to have a child, because part of me knew what world I was bringing them into, a world where if they were disabled, they would face discrimination, a world that if they were disabled, that they might not be able to move around in like other non-disabled people. But ultimately, I came back to remembering who I am and knowing that I am the best person to make this decision because I've lived it.
The book has so many instances of that kind of strength where people kind of take a similar journey that you did of like questioning whether they could be parents or wondering how it was possible, facing opposition and making the decision to become a parent anyway. And I don't know, I guess maybe I shouldn't have been so surprised how often negative comments would happen or how often people would describe being laughed at or these things that it's just really... It's painful to read the experiences of these parents and the kind of stigma they're facing. I'm thinking of like Kathy. I apologize. I don't know how to pronounce her last name.
Kathy Ray. Yeah.
Ray. Okay.
Yep.
So yeah, she was basically asked straight up by her doctor if she wanted to keep her baby who had dwarfism like her. So she was already pregnant, and the doctor's like, "Well, do you want to keep this?" To a person who has that condition, which is basically saying like, "Are you even worth like having around in the world?" It's a shocking, some of these stories it was pretty shocking, I have to say, and eye-opening for me as a generally able-bodied person to know the kind of things that they're hearing. What about on the flip side? Were there any stories in the book where people had a positive experience with medical professionals that were more supportive than some of the negative stories?
Yeah, I think you're like spot on when you talk about Kathy's experience. And when I spoke about that discrimination out in society, that was one of the parents that I was really thinking about. And I think being short-statured and having dwarfism is, in my opinion, one of the most discriminated and ridiculed and stigmatized disability. Often it's seen as a joke or made fun of. Historically, we've seen people with dwarfism, as the, 7 dwarfs or as a comedy joke in a film. And I think that's really fed into this idea that, to have achondroplasia or to have dwarfism is this real negative, when actually Kathy is a successful writer, has a brilliant life and family. So I just think, again, it's just these misconceptions that feed into our ableist ideas of what having a disability is, or the experience is. But I guess, a positive, I think that a story that is in the book by Danny Izzy, and she's an American mother who, just had a really positive experience with her medical professionals that luckily she was kind of wondering whether she should be put into, I guess, what is called a high risk pregnancy. So she is a quadriplegic and a wheelchair user, and she was decided to, they kind of gave her a choice, but she ended up deciding to go into the high risk category. And in the end, that was fitting because she had twins. And if you were going to have twins, you would have to go into that high risk space. But throughout the whole pregnancy, they were just so supportive. They constantly told her that, she's got this, that she can do it. And they gave her a lot of choice and freedom and a lot of support. And so when I spoke to her for the book and just said that question, like, what was it like in, the medical space? I was pleasantly surprised that she came back and said it was absolutely fantastic. And to be honest, it was like potentially one of the only stories that came back like that.
Yeah, it seemed like the exception to the rule. We'll come back to Danny in a little bit because her story is also powerful, and all of them are. Preparing for the interview is difficult because every contribution to this book has something unique to offer, in addition to hitting a lot of these common themes that we're talking about already. You mentioned the fears that you had about the possibility of passing on your genetic condition to your children, and you're a proudly disabled person. You've enjoyed your life, and you said that you're in some ways have a certain gratitude about the things you've learned from being disabled, which isn't to dismiss the difficult things about it or to ignore the social stigmas against it or the obstacles that it raises, but you still had enough sort of internalized ableism to worry for your children and not necessarily want them to have that same thing. And so people would wonder, like, you have the kids, did your condition pass on? And have you talked with them about whether it could have or whether it couldn't have? How has that worked out?
Yeah, I think that I would be lying if I said that I don't. There's not part of me that is wondering. So I've got two children now, an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they're both not showing any signs of my disability. And saying that my disability is one that can happen at any point in your life. So for me, my symptoms started happening at age 5, but you can develop my disability at the age of 10, 15, 20. Sometimes people don't ever show symptoms, even though they're a carrier. And some people might start to develop symptoms at age 60. So we're unsure at this point in time. The only way that I can test for this is through a what I class as a very horrible test. It's like a electric shocks that you have to go through your system to be able to see if you have nerve damage. As a child, I remember having these nerve testing, and it was traumatic. And just really a lot of pain and confronting as a child to not really know why. And so I think I don't want to put my kids through that. And I would only do that if they were showing symptoms. And I'm even unsure if I would do it at that point, just because it is what I remember such a traumatic, painful experience.
I'm thinking of other parents, too, that kind of had the same worry. Sam Drummond is one. He's another person in the book who has dwarfism, and he talked about the experience of dwarfism in ways that I hadn't encountered, that it can be very physically painful. He talks about walking around his neighborhood and the kind of physical pain in his body and his joints and his arms and legs, and he's really candid about worrying about his own daughter's experience of pain and physical pain and also emotional pain and the sort of social stigma that she'll face. And He says this is his moment of great doubt. Here's a quote from him. He says, "Can I feel this grief and also still be disability proud?" So to be proud of who he is as a person, but also grieve the fact of the pain and the fact of giving that pain to a child and wrestling with that. I see so many people in your book, and you yourself seem to have had that same question of like, can I experience this grief and let it be what it is, but also be proud of who I am?
Yeah, I think that you can. That's my answer to that, because I see it taking place through these disabled parents, and I feel it myself. And I think that as a human experience, I think we can feel both shame and pride at once. And I think as a disabled person, when I walk into a room, I can feel really visible in that people look at me, some people laugh, generally groups of men, for some reason, think it's a funny idea to have a laugh. But I can also, whilst I can feel very visible, I can also feel very invisible in that I can feel like people don't know how to speak to me or sometimes I'll have people speak to my partner instead of me, like say, does she need a chair? Or, so instead I'm right there, and yet
You're
they
right
won't
there.
speak to me.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think as a human, we can feel, two very contradicting experiences at once. And I think that is very true, especially when we think about the people that we love. And as I said, that I think it can feel like you can feel guilt if you pass on your disability. But I think that guilt, as I said, comes from the world we live in for the most part, the inaccessible, ableist world that we live in. So I think when we fear our children's experiences, we just want our children to live fulfilling, happy lives and to live in a world as a disabled person that is hard and has barriers. I think that's where the fear comes from. So I guess that's where I find my passion is trying to eliminate or at least change, if I can, some of these barriers that we face by, having representation of disabled people and disabled parents and showing what's possible, I think makes for a kinder world.
That's Eliza Hull, editor of the book we're talking about, We've Got This, Essays by Disabled Parents. I really enjoyed seeing the parenting that the parents are doing. It wasn't just a book about the decision to become a parent or the kind of obstacles that are faced in that quest, but also just what it was like to be a parent. For example, there are some parents who didn't want to make their children have to perform caregiving roles unnecessarily or whatever. I'm thinking, for example, of deaf parents, Brent and Mel Phillips. They don't expect their hearing kids to interpret for them, for example. So there's this negotiation that can happen, a parent with disabilities, where in some ways they might lean on their children or rely on their children in some ways. And in other ways, they want to give their kids independence and not give their kids the sense of obligation toward them or sort of, quote, burden them with, caring for a parent. So talk about that tension a little bit and how you've experienced that and what you learned in talking to other parents with disabilities.
Well, I realized, I think that what Brent is, it's so important that we are, like, as disabled people, we all feel and experience the world differently and we all have different opinions. And that is what I think is so incredible. I think it's important to say when you meet one disabled person, you meet one disabled person. Like,
right.
You're not going to meet, we all experience the world differently. And I think Brent's experience is extremely valid because, him and his partner are both deaf, both his children are hearing, and he doesn't want his children to have to interpret for them. He wants to show his children that he's capable because he is capable. He's a CEO of a huge organization here in Australia. He's part of Parliament in advising the disability minister. He is a football lover. He's just a great person, and I think he shows so well what a deaf person can and does achieve in this country that I live in. But I think well, I realized that this kind of idea that a child shouldn't take on any caring responsibilities is kind of, in my opinion, a little bit ableist. I realized that I'd kind of been fed this lie that to have a child care for others was like I wasn't fulfilling my role as a parent. I wasn't good enough, actually. So whereas I see it as like, I'm still the parent. I'm still capable. I do it, everything for my children, just like any non-disabled parent would. But there is something really beautiful as I'm crossing the road and my daughter is holding my hand and telling me, to watch out for the step ahead, or sometimes she might move the toys on the floor because she knows that I might trip on them. That to me is building a very compassionate, kind human being that I'm seeing play out in her schooling, where teachers are saying that she's just a very caring, inclusive person. So I just think it's building my child's capacity to be a good person. I don't see it as a burden on her. I see it as the opposite. I see it, our family showing her a way in the world that is just ultimately very kind and thoughtful of others. So I guess when I started to worry about those things, it made me realize that maybe that was just due to thinking I had to do it all, or if I had help or support that I was somehow less than. But I think, what I do also love about Brent's example of his not wanting his children to interpret for him, he actually speaks about his child wanting to interpret for him. For instance, when they're going to pick up takeaway food, his daughter says, please, can I interpret for you? Like, she loves it. And they're actually now learning sign language at their school.
Cool.
And the two children who had been brought up learning both Auslan Sign Language is called here, whereas it's called American Sign Language in America. Learning ASL as well as learning English at the same time as children, and how that's just, again, build up their capacity to be great communicators into beautiful languages. So now they're actually the teachers of sign language, helping the actual teachers at school. So it's wonderful that by learning sign language at school, that their family is less stigmatized. And I think there are a couple of stories in the book where it shows just how, if you have that representation, in school and learn about disability, that you start to reduce the stigma that people face.
I also enjoyed reading parent stories about their own curious kids and how their kids reacted to disabilities and learn about it as they grow. Your young daughter asked one day, "Mommy, why do you walk like a penguin?" She's learning about your disability and just asking you such a sweet question. And we see kids throughout the book that are learning about their parents' disabilities. And it's not always all at the same time. And some parents kind of don't talk about it as much compared to other parents. I'm thinking of like Jasper Peach, who's a queer parent with fibromyalgia, and they're sort of like, I'm not sure when I really want to unpack this with my kids. And then other parents couldn't hide it if they wanted to. Your daughter asked about the way you walked, for example. And so we do get to learn about different conditions and different parents and different people and how they talk to their own children about disabilities. As you were interviewing different people or going through different stories, did it shed light on your own parenting? What are some of the things you learned as you encountered different parent-child interactions and how they learned about their parents' disabilities?
Yeah, I think that it was, as you say, it was such a beautiful experience when my daughter noticed for the first time. And instead of seeing it as like tragic, she saw it as just, like, why do you walk like a penguin, Mum? And then, we had a laugh together, and then I explained it. And some other children, noticing it, like, for instance, to deaf parents, Brent, and his children, they actually just started to tell their parents, when someone was at the door, before they have a visual cue. When someone comes to their door and the alarm, the doorbell goes off, they have a flashing light. But sometimes the children would actually tell them, I can, someone's knocking on the door right now. Or they would tell, somebody, they also had a buzzer that they would wear, and it was a vibrating alarm. If one of the babies at the time was crying, it's called a cry alarm, and it would buzz if the baby was crying. But sometimes the other child would say, just before it started to buzz, I can hear the other child crying. And so it was like, starting to realize, my parents can't hear, or my parents can't see. And I think what every story shows is that it just becomes normality, doesn't it? Like, it doesn't change anything. Yeah, it just is. It's just quite neutral. The way kids see it is neutral. They don't see it as the best thing, most positive thing, but they also don't see it as a negative thing. They just see it as what how their family exists in the world. And I kind of really appreciate the way children see disability. I think that fear and stigma of disabilities is often learnt over time and taught over time. So I think seeing it from children's eyes is a beautiful thing.
It is a really beautiful thing. There can also be some growing pains along the way. It's tragic when the societal stigmas get picked up by the children themselves, and it changes how they see their parents. There's this heartbreaking story in the book written by Micheline Lee. And she's an Asian woman raising a boy who's white, which she says already raises some eyebrows because it's much less common to see an Asian parent raising a white child than to see a white parent who has an Asian child. And it's also appearance-based. But Micheline also uses a wheelchair. She tells a story that happened one day when she arrived at her child's school to pick him up, and she accidentally tipped out of the chair onto the ground, and she was stuck there. And off in the distance, she could see her child, and her child saw her, and she saw that her child saw her, and he looked ashamed, and he didn't come over to help her. He just left her there on the ground. And this is a young child absorbing stigmas around disability and then feeling shame about it, not knowing exactly what to do with that shame. It's such a heartbreaking story.
Yeah, it is. Like, she is an incredible writer. And when I read her story, I cried. And in fact, every time I read it, I cry. I think that when you are just truly vulnerable, it just is so beautiful to read. And she doesn't hide anything in her writing. She really speaks from the heart. And, I did wonder whether, I think, as you grow up as a child, like, you start to, at times, pull away from your parents, don't you? And I think that my parents didn't have a disability, but I still felt that. I still kind of was like, oh, Mom, don't drop me right out the front so everyone can see. I think that, I think there is that time where you just start to want to feel that independence. So I think as disabled people, we can be really hard on ourselves. And I think that we, over time and over the years, due to like the stigma that we have faced and the staring and the laughing, we feel a lot of shame. We feel a lot of internalized ableism. Sometimes we are afraid of who we are. And I think that really comes through in Micheline's story. And, I'd be curious to speak to her son now and say whether he remembers that experience and why he didn't want to go near her at that time. And who knows? But I think a lot of it can be just, that feeling of when we're around our peers as young people wanting to fit in, and to have a parent that might, look or act slightly different can be hard as a child, because as children, we do just want to fit in, don't we? We want to be accepted.
And for Micheline to kind of tell that story, there's a temptation there to make some huge, big revelation about it, or to use it to kind of teach a point. It seemed like she just wanted to share that experience of hers, and she wasn't necessarily trying to be inspiring with that story, but rather just to explore what it's like to be a parent with a disability. There are other people in the book, like Nina Tame, for example, who talks about the problem of having to be inspirational by default. This idea that if you're a disabled parent, people are going to say things to you like it might be an improvement on the sort of negative comments people get, but it'd be like, aren't you a hero? Or like, look at you go, or, sort of trying to encourage you, which is also sort of its own ableism and sort of condescension about, I'm just a person going about my business. I really don't need applause from from onlookers here. So the pressure of being inspirational by default is another thing that parents with disabilities face. And that's one that I hadn't really spent a lot of time thinking about myself. So that was eye-opening.
Yeah. An incredible Australian disability advocate who has unfortunately passed away, Stella Young, coined the term inspiration porn.
Mm-hmm.
And that is when you are told that you are inspiring just for doing very ordinary things. For instance, Stella was nominated for an award as a young person. And she was like, what have I done? Like, all I've been doing is, at the time, watching, Buffy, the vampire TV episodes after school and coming, going to school and coming home and doing not much. Why would I be nominated for an award? And I think that's, I really liked that analogy. And I think as a parent, it can feel like that. I think it was about 2 days ago, I was just down the street with my kids and someone came up to me and said, God, you do so well. You're amazing. It's like, I looked around, I'm like, all I'm doing is going into the shop like everybody else with my 2 kids.
And you're used to it. Like, this is your life,
Yeah, it didn't feel remarkable at the time, I have to say. But I guess that again is that media representation, is that disability has been really seen as tragic. So often it will be like, you'll see an advertised, ads or movies where someone will have an accident and their whole life is tragic. It's over. The life as they knew it is gone. It's really seen in that kind of doom and gloom. Or it's often portrayed as that real, like, inspirational, like, they're just so incredible, aren't they? And often it is seen as the disabled. It's seen as that othering language of, people over there, not people within our community. It's very kind of othering language, and often euphemisms like special or handicapped or differently abled, just giving it a go, just trying, being incredible. And often we're just living our lives and doing very ordinary things. I think that we can be inspiring, but, I see us as inspiring when we do incredible, inspiring things, like when we're sports people or great musicians or artists, or doing things that are remarkable, not just living ordinary daily lives.
Yeah, this reminds me of Lucy and James Catchpole. They talk about this too. They're a disabled couple, so both of the parents are disabled. James is an amputee and Lucy uses a wheelchair. And wow, to see Lucy talk about what it's like to see people interact with her partner. And they'll say things to him like, aren't you incredible? Aren't you amazing? Because here you're this amputee and you're really carrying the load for your family, which is for her, what she's really hearing is, wow, isn't Lucy such a burden? Isn't Lucy such a problem and a drag? And what a hero you are for pulling her through. And so she talks about this tension between what's been called the super crip, which is sort of this like superhero type person with a disability who's so incredible, versus being a burden, and that there are expectations put on people with disabilities to perform one of those roles, to accept the role of super crip and really live it out, to inspire people, or to accept that you're just a burden and a problem for other people. And in their marriage, it's happening between partners because one of them is being perceived as a super crip and one of them is being perceived as a burden. And that story, I think, really gets at the heart of that dynamic of super crip versus being a burden.
Yeah, you're spot on there. And I think they share that experience so well, don't they, in their story. And in fact, they've just written a children's book called You're So Amazing. And it's about a boy with one leg. And at school, people just keep saying how incredible he is. But he's just like the other child. He's just doing ordinary things, and just what that can feel like to be seen as the, inspiration poster child when you just feel like every other child.
Yeah.
And it can feel really patronizing actually, and it did the other day when I experienced that, because I was just being very ordinary at the time.
Right. And it's like
So I think
you
it's
don't need those extra kudos. You don't need that like pat on the back. You need a door that opens, automatically, or like a curb cut that allows you to walk to a place. Like you need accessibility. You don't necessarily need cheerleading. You need changes in physical environments that
exactly.
make it better for you to get around. That would be a lot better than any sort of like applause that strangers might give you on the street.
Yeah, spot on. If you're feeling that, passionate and inspired, why don't you then look at your local community or look at your, the workplace or the building,
Yeah.
and think, well, why don't we make some changes here? I think you're
Yeah.
spot on.
Yeah. Right. Yep. That's Eliza Hull. And we're talking about the book We've Got This, Essays by Disabled Parents. And the subtitle says it all. It's full of essays by disabled parents. These are fantastic explorations of what it's like to be a parent who's deaf or blind or a quadriplegic or someone with dwarfism or autoimmune disorders, all kinds of parents with all kinds of disabilities, all of them talking about what it's like to be a parent and how parenting works for them. Let's talk about vulnerabilities here. A lot of the chapters talk about, as we've kind of covered so far, how built environments make it difficult and how they have to be really adaptive in certain ways to raise their kids. And Kathy, I think we talked about her a little bit earlier here. She's a single mom with dwarfism, and she talks about the fierce love that she has for her kids. And she says she doesn't regret becoming a parent, but she also candidly says that she wishes that she had a better understanding of what it was going to be like ahead of time, like a more realistic look of what it was like to what it would be like to become a parent. I think that could be a scary confession to make, to say, yeah, I'm glad I'm a parent and I'm doing this thing, but also, wow, it is actually really hard. And it's a lot different than what I thought it would be. That's a different story than, look at me go. We can do this. Anyone can be a parent. That kind of confession of vulnerability, I think, stands out in the book. And a number of people that you include here express that vulnerability.
I think that's a universal experience, though, of parenting. It's the way that we live in society now is it's isolating to be a parent. We don't live in community where we feel held. We don't have that kind of tight knit family that we live with anymore necessarily. And so it can be very lonely experience to be a parent, whether you have a disability or not. And I think Kathy's really beautifully put it, that it is hard, and just because we do parent and can parent, in my opinion, I say it in my chapter, is that actually I feel like we as disabled people are set up to be parents because we have lived in inaccessible worlds where we constantly have to adapt. And, for instance, when I go into a building, I have to kind of scan the building and go, okay, there's a step there. I have to hold on to that to get up. I can see an accessible toilet, but, I have to move that cleaning equipment to get through the door. And, you're constantly having to look at a world that isn't built for you and navigate it and problem solve and be flexible. And I think that parenting is really requires all of those skills. So I think that we also can be quite hard on ourselves as well, because we're always we at times are set up to fail by medical professionals, and we feel like we have to prove ourselves. And so I think that when people question whether we have the ability to parent or whether we're going to make good parents, I often say, well, I think yes, like we are so set up for it and we are so willing to give it all we've got because of that kind of fear. That some of it is a lot of fear of that our children will be taken from us, which still happens worldwide to many disabled parents. But I still think, what Kathy said around that she wishes she knew how hard it was, I think is still very true. but I would go as far as to say that that's for across the board for all parenting.
Yes, it certainly resonated with me. I also liked how Danny put it. We mentioned Danny a little bit earlier. She's the mom of twins who's quadriplegic. And here's a quote from her. She says, "I believe when it comes to talking about the challenges of parenting with a disability, we need to have a space for it. It's emotionally difficult to share the challenges because I'm often afraid people will judge me or discriminate against me, like they'll finally catch me out and say, see, you can't do it all."
Yes.
And as you mentioned, like that fear can be very grounded in reality. I'm thinking about parents with intellectual disabilities in particular, which several of your chapters cover, and one couple in particular who Child Protective Services is going to get involved and question their right to even have their children, which would be terrifying. Maybe spend a little time on those experiences.
Yeah. So, what Danny speaks about, I think, is for me what the online space has been. So I think having this book, having now an online space where we interact as disabled people has just been so incredible to have that community where you can share little hacks or little ways that you do things, how you can adapt. You know, I might say to them, how are you getting your child out of the cot? Is there any ways that I could do it? And we just kind of bounce ideas off each other. So that's been really a beautiful space. And to let our guard down, I think what Danny said is so true, that the fear that we're going to be caught out or that we're going to be seen as not capable is really hard. And as you said, parents with intellectual disability have this times a million, and often, as we've mentioned, parenting is complicated and hard and isolating. But when you have an intellectual disability, there are obviously added complexities, and to not have, in my opinion, what I think is still so problematic is just lack of support. And so parents are kind of really, in my opinion, set up to fail because they're being watched, they're being set up to fail, they're being discriminated against, and they're not being given any adequate support or education to be able to look after their children. And so what often can happen is that parents feel really overwhelmed, and there are times when you are not going to get everything right, and that happens to all parents. Like I remember when I brought my first child home, I was like, gosh, like where how do we do this? Like we haven't really been taught. Like, do we wake her up? Do we let her sleep? Do we? Yeah. And you don't really have the answers. So when you have an intellectual disability and then you're not given any support, you're not given any help, you're not giving any education, you're just kind of set on your way, it's really, really challenging. And as you said, often children are taken from their families, and we've got this as a family that share their experience of having to go through the court system to be able to keep their child, and having the judge within the court system say to them that he was just so apologetic that they had to even fight for their right to keep their child, and that they obviously were discriminated against, and that they have proven over time that they are competent, incredible parents. And I know that family really well, and their child is thriving and doing so well. And they have great support network around. They have parents that live right near them on both sides, and just a really successful family. So the fact that they had to constantly be monitored and watched and often stigmatized and discriminated against, and then fight to be able to keep their child is, really appalling. And I guess for me, it just feeds into that discriminatory ableist view that we don't make great parents or we don't make competent parents when we actually have proven that we do. And so I feel like they're a great example of a family that really turned it around. But that took a huge toll on those parents. There's also another family in the book, Ricardo, and
Donna, yeah.
Yeah, they're American parents. And I think that their experience was really great for me to see where you are more supported. And it was an American family. And whilst they did still face some discrimination and stigma, they felt like they weren't set up to fail, that they were actually supported by the people around them. And again, they've just had, they have a great family, and their son now has his own children. So I think we are and do see people with intellectual disabilities make great parents. But what we need, and I think that is across the board for all parents, what we need is support. And what we need is, education as well.
Right. We need to focus on structural solutions, not just individual ones. And this is a recurring theme on Relationscapes. I'm thinking, for example, of Angela Tucker's episode on adoption, on transracial adoption, where she talks about how as societies, we often decide to invest a lot of money in certain ways, for example, toward the adoption system itself. And we're willing to pump some money into that to help children become adopted, but we're not as willing to invest on the other side of that to help parents out who otherwise wouldn't want to send their kids away, who wouldn't want to have their children be adopted by other families. So we wouldn't have as many kids being removed from homes to begin with if we would invest on that other side, if we would address the structural issues that are impacting those families. We can invest in better supportive safety nets for families. That could be a whole episode in and of itself. But
absolutely. I think you're right. I think that, more funding needs to go into more support so that, we don't set up these parents to fail.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to note that there are going to be times where it is unsafe for a child to be with their parents. But that is whether you have a disability or not.
Right.
There are some parents that just, it is just unsafe for that child to be with that parent.
It's more likely when someone has a disability for the system to say like, oh, this is an unsafe thing and let's remove the kids, rather than this is an unsafe thing and let's figure out how to make it a safer thing.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it just still feeds into that, the discrimination that we as disabled people face.
Yeah. Basically, they shouldn't be parents anyway, so let's remove
Exactly.
them. So, yeah. Let's talk about strengths here more than the vulnerabilities. What really stayed with me from this book is how normal so much of the parenting here is, how relatable so much of it was, and how adaptive disabled parents can be with their own kids. So many of your contributors talked about how they have to navigate this ableist world. And so, like you said, you've had to exercise this kind of problem solving that's helped you be a better parent and be more adaptable and sort of assess the situation and come up with creative solutions to things. And that also doesn't turn people with disabilities into simple object lessons or like inspirational heroes. But I have this quote that you wrote here in the introduction where you say, the stories in this book show us how rigid the conventional template of parenting is, and these parents display an inner strength that any parent would envy and could learn from. So the adaptability and the creativity and the energy of these parents with disabilities is something that any parent, with or without disabilities, I think could benefit from taking a look at.
Absolutely. Yes, I think you're spot on there. And I think it's odd that we think that parenting has to look like a certain way. It has to fit a certain template. And if you go out of that, then it's problematic. Whereas what each parent is showing the reader is that, yes, we might do things a little differently, but we do things really successfully. And we have skills that we've learnt over time, or even just recently, if we've just acquired a disability, that make us, in my opinion, more successful as parents. And, there are things that I do that are different, like the way that, there were certain times when I knew that, okay, it might not be safe for me to hold my child and go down these stairs. So we would make a game of it, and we would sit and go down one by one together and have fun by singing a song as we were doing it. Or sometimes I don't, walk very fast at all, but actually that has enabled us to notice nature or go and look at the flowers. I'm also really patient because I would have to sit, I was a wheelchair user throughout school, and also had a lot of medical appointments and would just have to kind of be sitting and waiting for all the time. But I think that has built my ability to just be patient with my children. So I guess I try and see the real positives that we provide. But I think the biggest positive is just the children that we are creating, and through having a diverse family, whatever that looks like, is creating children that are, resilient, kind, thoughtful, open children that have learned that through having a disabled parent.
That's Eliza Hull. She's editor of the collection We've Got This, Essays by Disabled Parents. She's also a contemporary musician, a disability advocate, and a writer based in regional Victoria, Australia. She's been published in places like Growing Up Disabled in Australia. She has a children's book titled Come Over to My House. Her music's been used in TV and film. She's also received awards for her music, the Arts Access Australian National Leadership Award, the Women in Music Award, and the Music Victoria Award. So a lot of music, a lot of writing, and a lot of disability activism, Eliza. And before we go, and I should also say there's a ton of stuff in the book that we didn't even have time to touch on. There are chapters that deal with the loss of children, that deal with infertility and IVF, and a lot of different disabilities that we couldn't touch on today. So people really got to check the book out to get more of a sense of what we missed. But I want to end with our segment that we always end with. It's called Regrets, Challenges, and Surprises. And this is when I ask the author to talk about something they regret about the book now that it's out, maybe something they would like to change about it if they could, or they can talk about a challenge, what the biggest challenge was in putting the book together, or they can talk about something that surprised them in the course of making the book, a big takeaway, something unexpected. So you can speak to one, two, or all three of those. It's kind of a choose-your-own adventure. So regrets, challenges, and surprises.
I guess the biggest challenge was there are just so many disabled parents out there in the world, and so many interesting, unique stories. I wanted to make sure that I had a real cross-section of people of color, people that were identified as queer, varying disabilities as well, to make sure, disability doesn't just look like a wheelchair user, doesn't look like one thing. Sometimes disability can be more, more invisible. Like people have chronic health conditions, people are autistic. So trying to make sure that I had a real cross section of various disabilities, and it weighed heavy on me. At night, I would go, how can I only have this many stories when so many people were reaching out to me saying, can my story be in this book? So I think that was my challenge, but I feel like I got a good mix of people, and from various locations, varying disabilities, and different groups as well, minority groups, to make sure that it was a representative of people in the world that have a disability and are parents. One of the other biggest challenges was the name of the book. So I'm unsure what it's like in America, but here in Australia, we sometimes still today use person first language. So we say people with disability.
Yes, that's the most common in the States, yeah.
Okay. It's only starting to really shift now, where we're seeing disabled people, and that is identity first language. And so I was really nervous about saying essays by disabled parents
instead of parents with disabilities,
Yeah. I was nervous that whatever I did, I would get backlash or people saying that wasn't reflective of their identity or experience.
Yeah.
But in the end, I decided to choose the most, in my opinion, the one that was pushing up against the ableism, pushing up against this idea that we should hide, that we should fear our disability, that we should fix it or make it go away, and instead choose a label that is part of who we are. We are disabled by our world that we live in. We are disabled parents, and that's not something that we should feel shame or fear of. So I chose the kind of bold title, but that didn't come easy. I was very nervous, and I'm definitely someone that thinks too much. So I was nervous about going down that path. But to be honest, I've not heard one person push back on it, which is, I guess, a telling of the time that we're living in, where we are starting to really put our identity first and not see it as something that ought to be hidden.
Right.
Because really, person first language came from a time where we were really othered by, it was often, as I said earlier, the disabled or special or handicapped or worse. A lot of disability slurs were used. And so people had to fight for, I'm a person, remember I'm a person. Whereas now, I don't think we need to remind society that we're people. We are, we're kind of moved past that. And so to have our identity up front and center feels like a powerful statement.
Yeah, I think that's a really important conversation because I can see so many sides of it. On the one hand, I know some people don't want to be called a disabled person because they say, hey, disability is part of who I am. And if you call me a disabled person, that seems to put more weight on the disability than I want there to be. But like you said, on the other hand, to say person with disability could also be reflective of a certain shame around it or a certain stigma that still surrounds what it's like to be disabled. And so, like you said, I can see different sides of this. And I mean, frankly, I sort of chalked it up to maybe a little like regionalism too. I was like, okay, I know in the United States, and I've done disability studies. I did disability studies in graduate school, and it was certainly person first. Where I've seen the most pushback against that is in the autistic community, where most people in that community certainly don't want to be referred to as a person with autism. They're like, what are you talking about? I'm autistic. I'm autistic. Yeah. So that's really in the United States, at least, where that sort of identity pride, and there's not a reluctance there that we see I think in some others. So yeah, and I think the biggest thing for me is I just try to be tuned into what the communities themselves are talking, how they're representing themselves, how they're talking, and just be responsive to that. So to anyone who gets exhausted by all this, like, why do we have to even care or worry about it? Because we respect people and we want to honor their identity and talk about them in ways that's comfortable for them. So
exactly.
I think, it's going to be ongoing. I don't think we're going to like hit the the one true label that will always be true for all time. And so I think being flexible with it, but that was a bold choice and I like it. I think that it definitely is representative of the voices that you've gathered in the book, and which is it's a collection of vulnerability, but also a collection of pride. Both of those things certainly exist here with these parents.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't regret it.
Well, thank you so much, Eliza. This has been great. And like I said, we barely scratched the surface. I hope that people will check out the book, We've Got This, Essays by Disabled Parents. There's a ton to learn in here, not just about what it's like to be disabled, but also for parents in general, or for people that just want to know what parenting is like. People who aren't parents, people who don't want to be parents. There's just a lot here, a lot of different experiences. And I enjoyed every page of it. I really did.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I agree. It's just human stories that are quite universal. And I think I really appreciate it when a lot of people say, I'm not a parent and I'm not disabled, but I absolutely love this book.
Yeah. Well, thanks for spending the time with us, Eliza. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Relationscapes. Do you have a story about being a disabled parent? I would love to hear about it. My email is blair@firesidepod.org. That's BLAIR@firesidepod.org. You can also DM me on Instagram. And if this episode interested you, I also recommend checking out Jessica Slice's episode, What Disabled Parents Can Teach Everyone About Parenting. I would love it if you would do me a favor and rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. Reviews are kind of harder to come by lately. I'm not seeing as many come in. Maybe everybody was too busy soaking up that sweet summer sunshine. But I want to see more reviews. Send them on in. Go to Apple Podcasts, search up Relationscapes, scroll down, and go to rating and reviews. You can put it in right there. You can also rate the show in Spotify. It's really easy to do it there. The place is kind of hopping right now. I'm seeing a lot more ratings come through Spotify right now than I am in Apple Podcasts, and it's usually the other way around, so keep that going. Mates of State provides our theme song. Relationscapes is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I'm journalist Blair Hodges in Salt Lake City, and I'll see you again soon.